interesting things over here. These are state-by-state analyses. You can see the Bible Belt here and the purple one in the middle. The darker purple ones are people that feel more about God. This one at the bottom is kind of funny. On the left, this is a map of people who feel fat, and on the right is a map of people who are fat. And you see that they're actually inversely related to each other. So that the states that feel the most fat are actually the least fat states. And the fattest states don't feel fat very much at all, which I think is part of the problem. This is a spread called approval ratings, where we look at various celebrities and the positivity or negativity averaged out over all of the feelings expressed about them. So you can see George Bush has the most negative approval rating of all. Barack Obama used to have the most positive until after he was elected, and then it started to become more even. So, and similarly, Michael Jackson had an even approval rating until after his death, and then he became overwhelmingly positive. So this proves the old maxim that we like politicians more before they're elected and rock and roll singers more after they're dead. There's other ones here. It's separated into masterminds, moguls, athletes, actors, rockers, rappers, idols, and icons. So there's Paris Hilton and Britney Spears. There's the Pope, the Dalai Lama, Harry Potter, and Stephen Colbert. Trying to get on his show, so we put it. Anyway, so that's all I'm going to talk about work stuff now. I'm going to move on to trying to talk a little bit more about like what's been on my mind recently. So this is a portrait I did here of my fourth grade teacher, whose name is Ronald Bazzarini, and I recently befriended him. I hadn't spoken to him in about 14 years, and I still had his phone number and called him up, and it turns out he still lives in the same rent-controlled apartment in Chelsea, in New York City, that he's lived in all these years. And he's very old now. I met him for lunch one day, and he was so frail. He was wearing a three-piece suit like he always does, but he's in his late 80s now. But he told me lots of wonderful things, and two things in particular that really stuck with me that I'd like to share. One was he tried to tell me about what he felt the secret to good teaching was, to being a good teacher. He was kind of a legendary teacher. Everybody loved this man, and still tell stories about him. And he said that the secret to being a great teacher is actually very simple, and it's as simple as he put it, bringing yourself to class every day. And I asked him what he meant by that, and he said, well, I mean that, you know, a lot of teachers kind of craft this persona that they think they need to be like as a teacher, or what a good teacher should be like, but that he always came and was just completely himself. If he was having a tough time at home, he would tell the kids about that, even though we were fourth graders. If he was happy about something, euphoric about something, he would tell us. He was just totally straight with us. He was the only teacher that I went to a kind of fancy New York City all-boys school, and we had to call all the teachers sir. But he insisted we call him Baz. He wouldn't let us call him sir. So he was very insistent on this peer-to-peer relationship. And so that lesson of like bringing yourself to the classroom every day, I think is something that's really worth keeping in mind, even if you're not a teacher. And the second thing was that he was telling me a story about when he was in his early 20s. He was living in Long Island with his wife, and he was a young playwright at the time. And he would often spend the mornings gardening. And his wife, Corinna, would call him in for lunch. And he had this ritual of coming in for lunch, and they had a picnic table in their kitchen, and he would lie down on the picnic table and wait there looking at the ceiling while Corinna, his wife, was chopping the tomatoes. And one day he was doing just that, and he burst into tears lying there on the table. And it took him totally by surprise. He didn't know what was happening. And Corinna stopped cutting tomatoes and put down the knife and walked over him and put her hand on his arm and said, Baz, don't lose heart. And he stopped crying, and he regained his composure, and he tried to think why that had happened, what had caused him to feel this way. And what he told me he realized a few days later was that he had spent the last several years writing these plays. And with each of these plays, he tried to tackle these big topics. And he was very ambitious, and he was he had this big vision of what he should be talking about, even as a young playwright. And he had these beautiful ideas of what these plays were going to become, and invariably he became very disappointed because they never came close to measuring up. He said each play in its finished form was a fraction, maybe 20 or 30% of what his vision for it was. And he realized why that was the case, and what he said to me was, you know, Jonathan, what I was doing was I was trying to take the audience and I was trying to make them go, wow. But really, what I needed to do was I needed to take the audience and I needed to make them go, wow. And I said, whoa. Can you explain that again? And he said, sure. He said, I was trying to stun people. I was trying to bowl them off of their chair with special effects and big themes and grandiose ideas and dramatic prose. And really what I needed to do was I needed to be wise and humble enough to know that I didn't have the answers. Even though I was a playwright, I didn't have the answers. And what I needed to do was I needed to ask the right questions. And I needed to involve the audience in the process of trying to find answers to those questions because I didn't know them. And he said the difference between this wow and this wow is the difference between going to see some special effects action flick or some roaring comedy, which leaves you feeling really great, but then you feel this kind of emptiness beginning to set in a few hours later, like gorging yourself on fast food or donuts. Whereas you go to see some movies, like a Schindler's List or something, and these movies kind of haunt you. And they work themselves inside of you, and they're with you for years afterwards, and you keep remembering them. And that's the difference between this wow and this wow. And so these two lessons about bringing yourself to class each day and about the difference between the wows are really gifts that he gave to me. And I think they're really useful to keep in mind. So on that note, I'm going to tell you a little bit about where I am right now with my life and what's on my mind. So I had been living in Brooklyn, New York for the last 5 years, and I was living kind of right in the middle of it all in Fort Greene, a very cool neighborhood, and had lots of interesting friends doing all sorts of interesting things, and it was like, you know, the center of it all. And I just started to feel really lost, and I didn't know what my center was or what I was doing or what direction I was pointing, and I felt like I was just going through this process of trying to juggle so many things and keep track of so much stuff and digest so much novelty and try to process it and then be able to do something with it. And it just became really hard. And so in late August, I packed up my place in New York and ended my lease. And I bought a car and brought everything up to my mom's place in Vermont, put it in the attic, and then started driving out west here. And since middle of September, I've been living in this little log cabin in the forest in the mountains of Oregon. It's at about 4,000 feet, and it's on the site of an old summer camp that now has a kind of art residency there, but it's off-season, so I'm there all by myself, and most days I don't see anybody. And coming here to give this talk is actually the first time I've left here for about a month and a half. It's right on the shores of this beautiful crater lake, which is called Blue Lake. It's 350 feet deep, and it was a volcanic crater about 1,000 years ago. And it's very cold. It's 38 degrees all year round, and it's fed by an underwater spring. And the surrounding forest, as you can maybe see here, is just completely annihilated from a huge forest fire that happened there 6 years ago. So there's this odd smell in the air all of the time of burned out trees. All the tree trunks are blackened husks of what they used to be. It's kind of a post-apocalyptic landscape up there, but I find it really beautiful. And I turned 30 also at the end of August, and I started doing this kind of series on my 30th birthday, August 27th, where I started taking and posting to my website every day one photo along with a short little story that somehow related to that photo or what I had done that day. And I did this for a few reasons. I mean, one thing is I was looking back on my last few years, and I was feeling like the time had just slipped away, and I didn't know what I had really accomplished or what I had experienced or how I had grown. And I wanted to find a way to become more conscious of time as it was passing and of my life as I was living it. And I also wanted to become more observant about the physical world. I spent a lot of time behind computers, and I was feeling somewhat disconnected from the physical world. And so I started this process, and it's been really wonderful. So I would really recommend anybody to do this if you feel so inclined. And I plan to do this for a long time, maybe the rest of my life, I don't know. But it's really great right now. So actually, speaking of that, I'm going to take a picture of you guys. Maybe it'll be my photo today. Let's see. Yeah, that's not bad. OK, cool. Well, you guys can check my website, and tomorrow maybe you'll be on there. So I'm going to talk about a series of themes, pretty much one-word themes or a few words themes, and tell you some things about what I think about each of them, and maybe some of them will be useful for you. So one of the things I found when I was living in New York is that I was feeling very I was feeling like I had forgotten how to have opinions, because I was constantly taking in so much new information and hearing so many different perspectives on every issue that I couldn't take sides. It seemed like the world we live in now is just so complicated. I don't know how someone has an opinion about whether we should leave Afghanistan tomorrow, or whether Israel or Palestine is right, or whether abortion should be legal in all cases. You know, these kinds of issues, I'm sure people have thoughts on some of those, but there are this whole class of issues that I just find completely overwhelming, and I don't know how to have an honest opinion about them, because I can see both sides. And I think that what I started to realize is that there is a difference that's really important to realize, that just because some things in the world are too complex to have an opinion about, it does not mean that you can't have an opinion about any things. And if you take that stance, if you take the stance of just saying, well, I can't have opinions about anything, the world is too complicated, then this very quickly leads to cynicism and nihilism, and then you just are kind of just so negative, and you just drown in that. And I think that there probably are things that you can have opinions about. I mean, you can start with very simple things like, how do you treat your parents? And how do you act around your friends? What food do you put in your body? Like these things that you probably do know for sure. And I think what can be useful is to start there, simplify and forget about all the fancy stuff, and just ask yourself, what are the things I know for sure? And then put your feet there and kind of stand there for a while and just notice how that feels. And then once you feel comfortable, just take a little step and see, push out on on one of them, and see if you can push it a little bit further and see what that feels like. And keep doing that. Keep taking little steps until you find yourself in a position where you feel no one else is standing. In other words, you feel something to be true that no one else is saying. And then at that point, you should just stay there. Don't walk any further. Just stay there and try to make some beautiful things from that position, with that thing you just noticed. And I think that's the way that we can start to kind of make statements in this complicated world that can feel so overwhelming, is just by starting with small statements and then just take little steps from there. So related to this idea of opinions is the idea of beliefs. And I think beliefs have been going through a really dark period for maybe the last, 50 years or so. And I think it's very unfashionable to have beliefs nowadays in this age of scientific empiricism. And I think that there's a stigma around beliefs. There's certainly a lot of people who say, well, I only believe what I can prove or what I can see. And a lot of these people call themselves scientists. But I think that actually not all scientists are like that. I'm sure you all know a lot of scientists believe in some form of God. And I don't think having beliefs is inconsistent with having a scientific worldview. For me, the mystery in the world, the things that are not known, are what makes life worth living. I think if you know everything, there's no point really living. It's trying to close that gap between the unknown and the known that is where living occurs and where experience occurs. So I think it's great to have beliefs, and it's great to believe in mystery. The more mysterious, the better, I think. And my favorite movie director is a Russian director called Andrei Tarkovsky. And for him, the central point of all of his filmmaking was the idea of faith. He was crazy about this idea of faith. And for him, a person's humanity was directly proportional to the depth of his or her faith or his or her belief. And he made a number of movies that explored this idea in one way or the other. The inhumanity of those with no beliefs versus the humanity of those with beliefs, even if those beliefs are crazy. So I'm personally not a religious person, but I'm a very spiritual person, and I really believe in mystery, and I keep a very open mind to it. And I think that especially if you're in the business of making stuff, mystery is a very valuable ally that you can have, especially if the stuff you're making is less about how you see the world as being and more about how you see the world could be or should be. If that's what you're interested in doing, then mystery is a very powerful ally for you. So I wouldn't be afraid of beliefs. The next thing I'm going to talk about is vibrations. I'm sure a lot of you know this idea that everything is vibration. Of course, sound is vibration, but also light is vibration, color is vibration, that chair has a vibration, all living things, all inanimate objects, all of these things have vibrations, and they're each having their own vibration. And we too, as humans, we each have our own vibration. And I think I've been feeling recently that the vibrations of all things, like all people, everything, has been kind of speeding up. And I think we feel this, like in the volume of communication that we have to process, in the amount of new information we have to process, in the amount of relationships we have to manage, in the amount of complexity that we have to somehow cope with. There's just like this increasing vibration all the time. And when I was living in New York, I was starting to feel like this vibration was just becoming too much, like I was on this platform and I just couldn't really deal with it anymore. One of the other things about this vibration is that I think not only have human vibrations been increasing, but I think they've been becoming more homogeneous. Like I think our vibrations are causing us to become more the same. Like we read the same things, we listen to the same things, we watch the same things, we look at the same things online, we have our personas online in the same places, we use the same tools. And I think this, there's a certain argument you could make that this kind of identity convergence of humans is a good thing because it's kind of contributing to some kind of oneness, or like we're all the same, we're all in this together now. But I think that a dangerous side effect of this is that we're also losing our individuality. We're losing what makes each of us unique. And especially if you're in the business of creating things, if you're an artist or a designer or an inventor, I think it's really important to preserve your individuality, because that is the thing that allows you to have a unique perspective and to identify the things in the world that are not being done properly, and then you can maybe fill those gaps. And so I think it's important to reclaim your vibration, your own vibration. So, related to this is what I call our digital crisis. As much as I kind of escaped to the woods and I'm living out there in this cabin, I still feel really a part of the online world. That's where I make my work. That's what I'm known for doing. That's where my skills are. And I feel a certain obligation to be in that world and to see how that world can be made better. And I see the online world in a really bad situation right now. I think that this kind of mania with social networks and Twitter and Facebook and like all this communication is making us stupid. And I think that not only is it making us stupid, I think it's making us all look the same. I think that a lot of these services make all of us look like kind of the same generic character, and I think it's a bad thing. I also think it's not any news that a lot of really important industries to our human society are collapsing, like journalism and publishing, even radio to some extent, don't really know how to exist in this new world yet. And I've given some talks at like journalism schools, and these kids are basically saying like, man, I'm a journalist, but do I need to learn how to code? Do I need to become a computer scientist to get my stuff out there? And what I say to them is like, have patience. Like really, it should not be your responsibility to build tools to get your stories out. That should be the business of the tool makers. And they just haven't gotten around to doing that yet for you, but they should. They have an obligation too. And so I think the world right now is desperately in need of tool makers and people that can build good experiences for this digital world, which is developing in such an awkward, it's like a human growing, and one arm is like massive Hulk Hogan arm, and the other is like a shriveled alien arm. And it needs to like be balanced more. And otherwise, it's going to be a very deformed world. And I think that's kind of how it is going. So I really think this is a crisis. And as I said, I don't think there's an escape from this. As much as we might say, like, well, let's go back to some primitive, shamanistic, tribal time and live in the jungle and hunt antelopes. I don't think that's realistic. I think that the pull of technology is too strong for us to resist it. I think our future is going to be technological. There's a great quote in a recent biopic movie I saw about the inventor Ray Kurzweil, whose big thing is this concept called the Singularity, which basically is his prediction that there will be a moment when computers become able to rewrite their own source code. And at that time, they'll effectively attain consciousness and will start increasing exponentially until they consume all of the resources on Earth, and then will quickly expand out into the universe, and they'll consume all the resources in the universe. And he says, like, people always ask me, does God exist? And I say, well, not yet. But he says also before that will happen, there will be this kind of merging of man and machine. And it won't be like Terminator, where you have this war between the humans and the machines. It'll be more like we first have little nanobots swimming in our bloodstream, cleaning up cancer cells, and keeping us healthy and helping us live longer. So it'll be more of like a merging than a opposition. And I was actually at the premiere of that movie in New York, and he was there, and he was doing a Q&A afterwards, and somebody raised their hand and stood up and said, it was kind of one of these like real, like traditional humanist people, and they were like, but Mr. Kurzweil, don't you think the humans will resist and fight the robots? And he goes, well, I mean, maybe, but it wouldn't be a very long war. And so I think for a number of reasons, I don't think it's reasonable to think that our future is going to be anything but a technological one. So then the question becomes, what do we want that future to look like, given that it will be technological? How will the digital world be? How will it relate to our physical world? How can we make it better? And I think these are questions that people aren't quite asking yet, but I think they're going to ask really soon. For instance, if you look at the dominant communication medium over the last 50 years, you started with telephones. Then you had fax, kind of, not really dominant, but you had fax. Then you had email. Then you had chat. Then you have text messaging. And now you have tweets. I mean, it's not clear to me that there's a shorter and more concise communications means than the tweet. I don't, unless we get into like making monosyllabic grunts at each other. I don't think, in other words, I think that this trend of things getting faster and shorter and faster and shorter and faster and shorter is very close to hitting a terminal velocity when it cannot go any faster. And what will happen then? So what will happen when this force of compression and simplicity is pushing so hard, but there's nowhere to go? Well, I think two things can happen. One is there's a total breakdown of the system, and we go back to some kind of primitivism. Or I think there's a bounce. You hit a wall and you bounce, and you go back to something earlier. And I think, for me, I think that something earlier is a more meaningful form of communication. And I don't think the web is giving that to us right now. I think it's very good at doing breadth. It's very bad at doing depth. And I would argue that the web and these social networking and all this stuff has had probably, it has had a good effect in rekindling old high school relationships and this kind of thing. But I think in general, it's had a very negative effect on us as individuals and as humans. And like I said, I don't think it makes sense to just bitch and moan about this. I think it's up to us to say, well, okay, well, how can it be better? How can we make the web actually a place that is sensitive to the individual and to the human collective? But how can we do that? How can we design a better digital world, given that it will be digital? So I want to introduce this concept today. Maybe someone has said this before, I don't know. But this concept of world builders. And I hope that a lot of you guys in this room today, especially the younger people, will become world builders. And what I mean by that is people who take the role of deciding and defining what the digital world will look like. In the same way that we have architects who build our buildings and our cathedrals and our state houses and our capitals, we need people who will step forward and build beautiful structures for the internet, for this digital world. And you could say that this is a kind of an arrogant perspective to think like, whoa, who am I to do a digital world? I mean, I'm just a person. But I mean, there's actually a thing, something that Frank Lloyd Wright, my favorite architect, would often say to this when he would often propose that if he were given another 30 years, he said this in his 80s, if he were given another 30 years, he could rebuild America. He could make it a country with architecture that is actually is good for the individual and not oppressive. And people would always call him arrogant and say, well, who are you to be saying that you can redesign our country? And he would say, you know, a great nation should have a right to look to its great architects to build it great structures. And I think the same thing is very true for the internet right now. I see the internet very similar to how architecture was in the early 20th century, when you had these two competing forces. On the one hand, you had Frank Lloyd Wright preaching what he called his organic architecture, and on the other hand, you had the international style of kind of Mies van der Rohe and Le Corbusier, which was all about like mathematic precision and glass cubes and boxes. And they started as the same thing, and they quickly diverged. And for me, I'm not a big fan of minimalism, but I'm a big fan of simplicity, and I'm a big fan of Frank Lloyd Wright. So anyway, I think the world needs world builders right now for this digital world, and I hope that a lot of you will take on that call. You know, I think the obvious path, like from art school or design school, is to go work at an advertising agency, or be like a media artist, or be an academic, or be a professor. And those are all totally valid things. But I think you should also realize that there is this option of being a world builder, helping to shape this space. And don't say like, well, Google will take care of it, or Facebook will take care of it. They won't. You know, they're going to do more of the same, what they've been doing. There needs to be new world builders. So I hope you guys will take that up. So when you get into this business of world building, there are a bunch of ideas that come up, questions that come up that one has to answer. How will this world be? What will it be like? And so I'm going to just raise a couple of those now and talk about some of these questions. So there's this idea of simplicity. This is, as you know, a very fashionable idea in the last 10 years or so, championed by advocates like John Maeda and Apple Computer and Google. Simplicity is very, very hip, and I think for good reason. I'm a big fan of simplicity. However, I think there are a few things that need to be said and clarified about simplicity. First of all, I think there is a difference between simplicity and minimalism, and those two things are often conflated. And just by removing things and making things as Spartan as possible does not necessarily mean that you've made something simple. I think that simplicity comes not from taking things away, but from understanding what you're trying to do and doing just that. Einstein had a great quote about simplicity. He says, "Make things as simple as can be, but not simpler." And I think that's very wise, actually. So I would say that with simplicity, you need to really understand what it is that you're trying to do. And there's one other thing I wanted to say about this, but I'm not remembering. So let me just check. Yes. So I mentioned a moment ago that Frank Lloyd Wright had this idea that he called his organic architecture, or his organic simplicity. And I think that simplicity is like this parent, and it has like these different children, a lot of different children. One of the kids that it has is minimalism. That's definitely a child of simplicity. I would say that's kind of like the prudish, fascist, really hard-ass child, who's like not a lot of fun to hang out with. And then there's another child that I would call more like the natural, organic child. Maybe he's like the earth goddess, like dancing around in the forest or something. And but not that extreme. But I think that to succinctly express the idea of natural simplicity, you don't need to look any farther than nature. So look at nature. Nature is far more complex than anything humans could ever begin to conceive or imagine. But it is precisely as complex as it needs to be, and not any more complex. And that makes it simple. So I think that's a really useful distinction. Things can be complex and simultaneously simple, as long as they're only as complex as they need to be. So another really primary question when you're in the business of world building is language. What language is going to be spoken in the world, and what language will the world be constructed in? So what is language? Well, I think most basically language is a system for expressing ideas. So there are a lot of languages. There's English, Mandarin, Spanish, French, photography, dance, film, computer code, Java, Flash. All of these things are different types of languages. And what makes a good language? What are qualities of a good language? Well, I think succinctness is a quality of a good language, simplicity, succinctness. I think another quality is its capacity to allow people to express individuality. I think another one is the ability to use it to say a diverse number of things. I think these may be the 3 main traits of a good language. Maybe easy to learn is one, but I'm not sure about that. So you have to say, well, what language will we use? Well, there are certain times in life when the world has changed in such a way that that change demands a new language. No language exists to satisfy what has just happened. So some examples. Telegraphs are invented, and then Morse code is invented as a way of using this medium to communicate. Airplanes are invented, and air traffic control signals on the runway are invented. It's a new language. Computers are invented, and machine language is invented. And then that's too difficult, so C is invented. And that's too difficult, so Java is invented. That's too difficult, so processing is invented. So there are all of these layers of simplification that can be added to existing languages to make them more compatible with new mediums and new worlds. So when you're building a world, you have to say, well, is there a language that suits this world, or must I make a new one? And if you decide that you must make a new one, like Casey did, and I'm sure we all love processing, I do, you can be a language maker. But I think it's important to realize that you can also get trapped in language making if you're not careful. You can spend a lot of time learning languages and never get around to actually saying anything. And I think it's a very important distinction to make between learning languages and figuring out what you're going to use the language to say. And it's actually, I think, that second question that is much more difficult, but actually probably more important in the end. You do need great language builders, but you also need great communicators. So you have to decide which one you're going to be, or if you're going to be both, make sure you do get onto the second one, the second part of that at some point. So in this online world, in this digital world, what is the best language? Well, there are a few languages that are commonly used, the most basic being HTML, CSS, JavaScript. There's Flash, there's processing, Java applets. These are some of the languages that we have available to us. I've made projects over the years with all of those. I've done a lot of work with processing. I've done a lot of work with Flash. And I started to ask myself what was the best language for me to be using. And I looked at my projects, and projects like We Feel Fine, which have gotten a lot of acclaim and people like it, but they haven't really broken through. They're not projects that people use every day to make their lives better. They're just not. It's more like going to the opera once a year than it is putting on your favorite Beatles song to get you through a tough time. And I had to ask myself, do I want to be an opera maker, or do I want to be a song maker that helps people every day? And just for me, I decided recently I wanted to be more of a song maker. I wanted to try to see how that would work. So for the project I'm currently working on, I'm actually just going to use basic HTML and CSS and JavaScript, which I think is really the innate language of the web today. So if you want to make something that really integrates with the web, I feel like that's the language you should be using. It comes at the expense of being able to do certain complexity, but I think that if you want to have it reach a large audience, that's probably what you should choose. But that's debatable. But anyway, it's important to think about what language you're going to use to say something before you begin the process of saying it. I want to talk about special effects a little bit. I think we all have a notion of special effects in movies. And in my work, in online work, I think special effects could be thought of as motion, certain types of interaction, physics, some kinds of layering when things move around. And I think that in certain languages online, like Java, for example, there is really no technical constraint on the number of special effects you use. You can really just throw it all out there on the table and just have something that's wild and crazy. But when you're using something like HTML, it's much more constrained. You can't actually use a lot of special effects. So this is something you have to be conscious of. And I think when I was starting out, I did a lot of work that had really crazy special effects, like really complex visualizations that were very beautiful, but maybe were extraneous also. And I started to see actually a certain obscenity almost in special effects and in using them too liberally. And again, going back to Andrei Tarkovsky, that filmmaker I mentioned, he had a really interesting perspective on the use of special effects. He made some sci-fi movies, including Solaris, you might have seen. And he said an interesting thing about Solaris. He said, I tried to make it so that boarding a spaceship felt like boarding a trolley. In other words, he tried to make the special effects completely banal and ordinary, so they just kind of fit in with the narrative. As opposed to something like Minority Report, or 2001 Space Odyssey, or a lot of other movies which kind of fetishize technology and special effects and try to explain away every little contrivance. And I think the result is that Tarkovsky's movies age much better. They seem still today just as ordinary and timeless as they did in the early 70s, whereas 2001 Space Odyssey really feels like a product of the 60s, as I think Minority Report will really feel like a product of 2005, 10 years from now. So I think that if you're going for something to be ageless and timeless, it's good to really tone down the special effects and make them just flow seamlessly into the background. And you know, I think when you do that, when you're more restrained with your use of special effects, the process of designing something feels a little bit less like fashion design, where you can just kind of do anything, and more like maybe being a Japanese sword maker or something like that, like the Zen sword maker. And I'd much prefer to be the sword maker, largely because if there was a one-on-one fight, the sword maker would like totally win against the fashion designer. So, so I'm going to talk a little about ideas, where I think ideas live and come from. So I would say that the dominant view in neuroscience and mainstream culture is that memories are stored in the brain, and that we kind of think, and we think of like, oh, my brain is tired. But I actually believe that they're not. I believe that memories are stored kind of in the empty space all around us, in the ether all around us, and that our brains are less like hard drives and that store information, and more like radio receivers that tune into information. And this is going back to that idea of frequency and vibration again. I think that we each have our own frequency, and even though your memories and my memories are all mingling together out there in the ether, I can only see mine and you can only see yours because I'm tuned into my frequency and you're tuned into yours. But then you have some people like psychics and mystics who can kind of wobble their radio antennas a little bit and drift over to neighboring memories and glimpse those and glimpse collective memories. And that is actually my mental model of how the world is, but science obviously hasn't proved that yet, but I think they will. Just wanted to share that. So if that were the way things are, then what is creativity? What is genius? What is having great ideas? Well, I think it's really just being able to tune into things that are in the ether slightly before the rest of society is able to. So genius really becomes just this enhanced ability of tuning. And this is actually my mental model of how things work. So related to this is this idea of acting alone. And I think especially in American culture, individualism is really celebrated, entrepreneurship is really celebrated, the lone genius is really celebrated, and I think all of that is fine. I'm certainly living a very isolated life right now up in the mountains there, but I think that if you decide to work in isolation and solitude, if you decide to be a hermit or one who acts alone, it's important to remember that even though you're acting alone, you should be acting on behalf of the human world, of the society in general, because your ideas are mingling with their ideas, and you know, everything is kind of connected. So I think this myth of acting alone is a little bit of an illusion, and it can be useful to realize that, at least if nothing else, then to guide your work into an area that benefits everybody, that kind of raises the water for all ships. So I think just keep that in mind as you act alone, if you decide to act alone. A couple quick points on imitation. There's an artist I like very much, probably a lot of you like very much, called Donald Judd, who's kind of the father of minimalism. And he said something really good about imitation, which was that if you try to imitate somebody you admire, the best you can possibly hope for is to become a bad imitation of the person you admire. What you have to do instead is you have to identify the inventiveness that that person you admire had, and you have to find that same level of inventiveness in a different domain. So I think that's a useful way of thinking about ideas and of thinking about copying. Copying, too, can be useful sometimes, but it's good to copy what you need from something and then incorporate it into your own work and make it something new, as opposed to just regurgitating it and presenting it the same way as you found it. I guess related to imitation a little bit is the idea of reputation, how the world sees you. And this is an insight that will probably sound a little bit obvious, but I think it's useful, especially to younger people, and that is that you will become known for doing what you do. And that sounds really stupid, but it's actually a really useful thing to understand, because a lot of people, I think, feel that they need to kind of pay their dues or have this rite of passage or go through the ringer before they can really stand on their own and do what they want to become known for. And that is just the biggest mistake, because once you start paying your dues and doing the thing you think you need to do before you can get to the place you want to be, you're going to become known for doing that thing that you're doing just as a rite of passage. So if you want to become known for doing something, you should find a way somehow to start doing that thing as soon as you possibly can. If that means working at nights and on the weekends for no money around your other job, then do it. Because that is the only way, that's the only fast track out of the grind and the monotony, is to quickly put your flag in the sand and say, I'm somebody who does this, I do this. And then if you do it well and if you do it beautifully, people will start to know you as the person who does that thing. And then they might hire you to do that thing, or they might pay you money to do that thing. Or they might put your stuff in a gallery or in some nice person's living room or something. So I think that it's good to get on with the business of doing whatever it is that you want to do. Of course, to do that, you have to have a sense of what it is you want to do. What is your kind of magnetic north, as I call it? And that's obviously a very hard question. Some people never answer that question. Some people spend the majority of their lives, and then maybe when they're 65, they realize they really wanted to, be a basket weaver or something. But it's a really important question. And if you are lucky enough to be able to find yourself an answer to that question, then you still have to be careful not to get knocked off course, because life will throw so much stuff at you, and it'll always try to distract you and get you off your path. And so I think it's really important to periodically step off your path and just kind of look at where you are, what direction you're pointed in, and make sure it's the way you want to be pointed. And if it's not, calibrate your course and start walking again. So that process of checking in can be helpful. And one way that I've found can be good to do that process of checking in is to kind of simplify your life, to pare down your life, to take each thing, each relationship, each commitment, each possession, all of the stuff that you spend brain power on, to hold each of those things in your hand and look at it, and try to look at it as objectively as you can, and ask yourself, is this something that's really essential to me? Is this making me better, or is this weighing me down? And if the answer is that it's making you better, then you keep it, you put it aside, and now it's something you know, now it's something solid, and you can stand on that. And that can help you as you move forward. If it's not, then get rid of it. Try to just get rid of it as fast as you can. Otherwise, it's going to weigh you down like stones in your pockets. So I think that can be a useful process when you're trying to get to this clarity. A few things about irony. I'm not a big fan of irony in general, and I think that irony is one of these things that's kind of a slippery slope. It's an easy crutch that's often used by beginners, I think, and it's something that can quickly lead to sarcasm, which can quickly lead to cynicism, which can quickly lead to just being angry at the world, and that's not much help. So I think that you should avoid irony when you can. The poet Rilke has something good to say about irony. He says that irony should be avoided in all cases by beginners and used only by true masters as a way of driving home an already sharpened point that much further. So it is a tool in your toolbox, but one that should only be used when you have already mastered the situation and you just want that extra little then you can use it. But otherwise, it should probably be avoided. So I think irony is very related to criticism, and I think that it's much easier to critique things than it is to create things. And I like to be on the side of the creators. So I think if you want to be, then it's good to have a positive outlook, not an ironic one. So this one is a little bit out of left field, but it's something that's been on my mind, so I thought I'd throw it in here. This is this idea of science and spirituality, these are two domains that have traditionally been very much at odds. You know, there's all sorts of dichotomies that, that exist in opposition to exemplify this relationship: church versus state, evolutionist versus creationist, faithful versus atheist, all of these things. And I actually think that in the near future, I don't know when exactly, but in the near future, these two worlds are going to start to merge together a little bit. And I think that, in particular, science is going to move towards spirituality. I think science is going to begin to find the language in the experiments to prove and verify a lot of the things that mystics and more kind of new agey people have been saying for thousands of years. Things like karma, intuition, fate, telepathy, all of this stuff, past lives. I don't know if all of that stuff is real or not, but I think some of those things will begin to be spoken about in the language of science soon. So I think that's an interesting thing. It's related to mystery a lot. If you're interested in mystery, these are some of the things that remain very mysterious, but I think that might be unveiled soon. So an interesting thing to look for. This is there are a few principles. There are three really simple principles that I have used for a number of years now to hold up to each of my projects to ask if it meets these criteria. And they've been really useful guideposts for me, like things that I kind of really believe in and I can always go to if I'm unsure about something. And I started to, I'll tell you what they are in a second, but I started to come around to these when I was living in Italy at Fabrica, which Casey mentioned. And I had a really interesting boss there called Andy Cameron. He's a really tall British guy with like big Dumbo ears and huge feet. And I was there for about a month, and I mean I was there a year and all, but I had been there for about a month, and I was so excited. I was like a horse chomping at the bit, and I had all these ideas I had written in my sketchbook for projects I wanted to make. And I sat down with Andy one day and I said, "Hey Andy, I want to show you some ideas. I'm really excited about these. I want to get your feedback and see which one I should work on." And he sat me down. He said, "Okay." And I told him some of the ideas. He didn't really say much. He didn't really pass judgment one way or the other. And then I finished, and I was kind of disappointed that he hadn't said anything. And I was like, "Andy, so what do you think? Like, what should I do?" And he said, "Well, you know, when you're thinking about a new idea, ask yourself if it's something that the Italian everyman could understand." And I said, "What do you mean by that?" And he said, "Well, you know those old men in Piazza Signori on Sunday mornings who stand around with their three-piece suits and their bowler hats and their canes, and they talk about the gossip and who died that week?" And I said, "Yeah, I know those men." And he said, "Well, ask yourself if you could go up to one of those men and in your very bad Italian or in his very bad English, if you could express the idea that you're working on or you're thinking about working on and see if he would understand it and appreciate it. And if you can, you've almost certainly hit on something very powerful and universal. If you can't, you may have hit on something powerful and universal, but your odds are a little bit less." And I really took that to heart, and that lesson became the first of these principles that I've kind of roughly gone by, which is that projects should have a universal idea at their core that they're based on, a universal concept that would resonate in many different cultures and situations and demographics. So not an insider joke, but a statement that would resonate around the world. Number two is that they should be executed with as much simplicity as possible. And my definition of simplicity in this case would be basically anything that is unessential should not be there. And you have to decide what essential is in this case. And the third one is that they should have an element of play or nostalgia or beauty to them, something that humanizes them and brings them to life. And I think that's the one place that resists simplicity and pushes back and says, "Okay, I hear what you're saying, but we're going to do this anyway, because this is great." And that you should give in to that impulse sometimes, because otherwise you just end up with minimalism. So those three things: a universal idea, execution as simple as possible, and an element of play, nostalgia, or beauty, or something that humanizes it and brings it to life. I'm just going to mention quickly, This is the new project I'm working on, which I don't want to say much about, but it will basically try to offer up some solutions to some of the questions I was posing today about the future of the digital world, what that can be like, and how we can make it more human and better for us as individuals. So it's a storytelling platform I've been working on for a while, and I'll be working on it still for a while, another few months at least. And if you're interested in learning more about this or following it, you can go to cowbird.com and sign up, and you'll get emailed when there's something to see. But I just wanted to mention that because that's kind of what I'm working on up in that cabin. And that's all I was going to say. So thank you very much for listening. So I think we'll do some questions. Yeah? OK. I think she's got a mic, so if you guys have questions.
Oh, yeah. All right. Could you please speak into the microphone for our online audience? OK. Question.
Anybody? No questions? Come on, there must be. OK. There.
I wasn't going to form it in a question, I guess, but I guess there is always a question there. Let's see. I'm a painter, an aspiring artist, I guess, and I think a lot about, I think the kind of simplicity that you've been talking about, like really recently, it's been this new thing, but the word that I have been using has been elegance. And I feel like that word is actually, when you're describing the kind of simplicity you're talking about, that's really, elegance is really getting to the heart of that. And I'm not sure if you've thought about that term as opposed to simplicity.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think you're totally right. Yeah. In terms of how I thought about it, I always appreciate elegance, and I think that elegance is a side effect of a great execution and a great concept, and usually has a lot to do with simplicity. And maybe it's a better word because simplicity does have so much baggage nowadays, and it's used so much by corporate advertising campaigns, and just it's everywhere now. So that's a great suggestion.
Because I think the simplicity that you're talking about is so valuable because it's arising in situations that are actually really complex.
Yeah.
And so, I think elegance as an idea really describes something that is simple, but it's important that it's simple because it's part of something that's really complex.
Yeah.
So it's
I think that's good. I mean, I do think that elegance is also not without its baggage. I think that when I think of elegance, also coming to mind is kind of Victorian curlicues and italic typography and big swirly curvy things. And like nice curtains. So I think you're right, but I think all words have baggage because they get co-opted for reasons that they have no business being co-opted for. But it's maybe a question of which one has less baggage, or which baggage you can tolerate more. I think is that one there? Oh, two there.
You spoke about the natural as sort of the antithesis to the neurosis of the city.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you had any advice as to strategies for finding that natural if you happen to live in a large metropolis.
Yeah. Well, it's hard. I mean, it depends on your situation, of course. If you have a full-time job, I guess you have your weekends. If you have a full-time job from which they'll let you take a short sabbatical, then maybe you could have a month sometime. I think anything you can get is great. I've been in LA for about 3 days now, and I was feeling like really just not good. Like I just wanted to go back the moment I got here, pretty much. And I was staying with really good friends, and we were doing great, fun things like going for hikes and going like nice restaurants and went out, all this stuff. But I just wanted to get away. And then yesterday, my friend took me up to Malibu for the sunset, and I found just being there for like 2 hours, it was incredible. I could just feel my soul like coming back to life. And so even if it's like a few hours on a beach or up in the forest or in the desert, I think that can do wonders. The more time, the better, of course. But I think it's like anything. If you decide you need it in your life, you will find a way to make it in your life. You just have to really make sure that you need it there. And then the pieces will fall into place, I think. Maybe you won't be able to take a month living in a cabin, but maybe you can spend a long weekend somewhere or an evening somewhere, and maybe start with that. But on the other hand, I mean, we don't have to live in cities. I mean, everyone seems to be drawn to cities like this magnetic black holes, but I drove across this country to get out here drove from Brooklyn to Oregon, and this country is enormous. I mean, I never really realized it until I did this drive, especially living on the East Coast. Just your conception of space is one thing, and then you do this drive, and your conception of space, it's like a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. It's just like a totally different thing. And in places like Montana and Wyoming and Utah and Arizona, I mean, there's just so much space. So if you decide for real that you want to do the nature thing, then quit your job and tell your friends you'll see them in a few months and go and live for like a fraction of the rent you're paying in LA in some little town somewhere, or even in some forest somewhere. But it does take that commitment to severing your ties a little bit from like being in the know every little moment, like that party, that concert, that rock show, that opening, that whole thing you have to kind of do without if you really want to do the nature thing. It's trade-offs. Yeah, why don't you do that and then we'll come here.
Hi, we actually just got here and so missed your whole talk. But we saw an electrical
It was mainly about gardening.
explosion, actually, telephone poles
Wow.
falling apart, and it was kind of crazy.
Wow.
So,
Where
but,
was just outside?
where was that? I'm not very familiar with LA. I kind of have the same feelings that you do. But Highland and Sunset, big explosions. But anyway, sorry, that's besides the point. I'm a longtime fan of yours, and I've been kind of watching your work ever since like word count, and I think you do really awesome stuff. And I'm kind of in the same, I work with the same media. I'm like a designer and a programmer, and I've been doing it for a long time. And I'm trying to transition into a space where I can work more as an artist, as a self-sufficient artist, rather than doing projects for other people and expending a lot of creative energy on something that ultimately is beneficial for someone else's purposes. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you, for yourself, have made a name for yourself and sort of been able to create the works that you create and sort of subsist on that kind of work.
Sure. Well, I'll just preface that by saying that it's not like I'm a successful artist in an economic sense. I've never sold anything in my life, even though I made that remark about making something to put on nice people's living room walls. I've actually never done that. So I got lucky to be included in a show at MoMA. That was kind of a fluke. I was like, I was doing information visualization, and they wanted to include that in the show, so I got to make a piece. But that's really it. I mean, I had one show in a Fabrica group show in the Pompidou, and this one at MoMA. But most of my work most of my early work up until the whale hunt, so 2007 and before, I made on weekends and at nights around a full-time day job that I had. And that just meant having no social life for 3 years, pretty much. And then I quit my day job in late 2007, and since then I've been living pretty humbly, really. I mean, I give some talks like this, but that really dried up a lot when the economy collapsed. And I did one commercial project last year for a group called Sputnik in New York, and that gave me some income, but I'm definitely not like rolling in the dough. But I've decided at this point in my life, I don't have kids, I'm not married, And I don't really have a lot of financial responsibility right now other than paying rent and eating. So at this point, I've decided it's more important to me to make work and see how much of that I can squeeze out of myself before I have to start worrying about those other things. So it's not sustainable, but for now, that's where I am. So I'm kind of in the same boat as you. Like, I'm still looking for a more long-term source of funding. But I don't know. I kind of believe that, like, if you do nice things for the world will pay you back somehow. And I try to build things that people use and that bring beauty to people's lives. And I don't really ask for much for that. I don't, like, they're all free, and I put them up for free. And I feel like just the whole karma thing, like, it'll work out somehow. I don't know how, but so I don't know. Sorry, I can't give you more, like, practical advice. Yeah. Lauren?
Yeah, I guess we were talking earlier kind of about critique versus creation or proposal of alternatives.
Yeah.
And I just was thinking, like, what if the thing that you're trying to create is a general raising of awareness, of everyone, so that, we can see more kind of the patterns we're falling into that you've pointed out some of them, or what's going on. And then maybe we can all start to rethink and redefine our relationships and the ways we interact, instead of having to rely on these few people that are making tools that redefine them for us.
I see. So almost like being more of a catalyst that provokes other people to create stuff that is needed.
Yeah, like critique as a way of creation of this awareness.
No, I think that's a wise point that you make. I think my criticism of critique has more to do with criticizing the things other people have created, and your notion of critique is more criticizing the way that we all live, and I think that is a really useful thing. I mean, in some ways, I was talking to somebody about this earlier today. I don't remember who it was, but I see in a way. The role of the artist, two kind of metaphors come to mind for how I think about the role of a certain type of artist. One would be that you're trying to kind of run out in front of where society is as far as you can until you can look back and kind of see the shape of it, and then take note of what you see, and then kind of chill out and let yourself fall back, and then make something about what you just saw, and then show that to them. Now, that, I think, traditionally has been a very common way of the artist. But I think one thing I was feeling when I was in New York is that was becoming very hard, because the pack was starting to move so fast that it became almost impossible to get out in front of it to be able to look back at it. And so suddenly you were in a position of having to say something about the pack from within the pack. And that's, of course, harder than saying something about the pack when you're away from the pack. So that's one of the reasons I left New York. But so that's one thing. I think there is this role of saying something about the pack and then letting the pack deal with what you just told them. The second is I can also see the role of the artist as like this little insect that's kind of walking out in front of the pack again, but specifically of scientists and of technology makers. And you kind of have your antennas up, and you kind of listen for what you think is going to happen next. And then you kind of transmit that signal back to the scientists, and they come through with their clipboards and buckets and brooms, and they're kind of like, oh, that was right. No, that was not right. That was right. That was not right. So it's kind of this symbiosis between people having kind of visions, if you will, and then people confirming or refuting those visions, and making new tools and new systems and new worlds that respond to some of the criticism of those visions. So I think that's a totally valid role to play, for sure. I don't see that as my role so much, but sometimes, and there needs to be people like that too. Yeah.
This question is regarding your criticism of, well, I don't, not a harsh one, but and I agree with it, of the current state of the internet and just networking, and maybe you can talk a little more about your reaction to it's almost like capitalistic growth, where it's in a way like libertarians would argue it's like a natural growth, and how that differs from your kind of what you're proposing as a natural solution, like nature-based. Can you maybe talk, maybe try to differentiate those two?
Well, I think that it has a lot to do with what the interests are of the people that are making the things. And if the interests of the people who are making the things have to do with making as much money as they can, or showing as many ads as they can, or even getting as many page views as they can, then that leads to a certain set of decisions. If the interests of the people making the things are that they themselves want to use those things to make their own lives better, then the type of decisions they will make will be very different types of decisions, because they'll be based around what's best for the person that's using the thing more than what's best for the bottom line or growth or the company or whatever it is. So I think it has a lot to do with intention. And in terms of the capitalistic growth thing, yeah, I mean, I think that this like growth and compound growth and compound growth is like numero uno problem with the world right now. I think it's kind of like the parent problem of a lot of other problems. And I don't see why, well, I see why, but I think it's a shame that people can't just kind of be happy with something good, why it always has to be like so much more extreme and more big and bigger. And I mean, that's another discussion, and I'm really not an expert on that stuff. I know it has to do with like the way Wall Street is structured, but you know, and people have been bemoaning that ever since Karl Marx, but so it's nothing new. But you know, yeah, it's a problem, and I think that there is a space on the web, I hope, and on the digital world for people to make things for the second kind of reason I described, which is, let me make something that's going to improve my own life. I'm going to use it. I'm going to make something, and I'm going to use it too. I'm not just going to make it for other people. Yeah.
I'm going to follow up that with, I guess, your reaction to the idea of the means to work being free and open to the public, like the means to create work. So, for example, studio space, that is public and open, like that kind of system in a society.
You mean, could you clarify that a little?
Like, I was just wondering your reaction to, you know, that kind of system where the means to create work is free and open to the public. So anyone could have the means to create something.
But don't you think that anybody does already?
Yeah, so, I mean, personally, not completely, but I think the internet helped that. Yeah. So I was wondering your reaction.
I mean, I think it's pretty easy to get together in your apartment with your friends and build something with your laptop and all the free open source software that exists. Of course, there's certain types of things you can't build that way, but there are a lot of things you can build that way. So I actually don't, I haven't found that to be an obstacle to me very much. Like, I've kind of just get on with it and make stuff. But I guess I haven't made anything at the scale of like a Facebook or a Google or something like that. So, yeah. Yes. One more, and then we'll stop. Okay. I think in the front row she's been waiting for a long time. Or you could just, oh yeah, for the web audience. Right here. Oh yeah, I hear it's really popular in Croatia right now. Town square gathering. Everyone's eating blintzes.
So it seems like you've been through this sort of internal transformation by your move to Oregon. And I was wondering if you had to choose between pen and paper and laptop. What would your choice be?
Laptop.
Why?
Because I think that's the language of today. I think that you should use the language of your time. No offense to the oil painters in the audience, but you know, I think that the internet is amazing, and the scale of things that happen there, and the ubiquity of it, and the reach of it. There's never been anything like it before, and I think when you have a tool like that at your disposal, why not use that tool? I mean, certainly words can spread very far, especially eloquent ones, but you can also use your laptop to make words, you know. But I love my sketchbook. I always have it with me, but I would choose the laptop for sure.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, thank you guys very much.